And I am going to talk about a little bit of work that's part of a larger project focused on dwarf mistletoe and black spruce. Ella right after me is she's also on the same project, but doing a little bit of different kind of measurement and modeling things. So I'll let her talk about that. But I did more work on a social science aspect of it, where we were really interested in Minnesota's loggers and foresters and their perspectives working with dwarf mistletoe and black spruce. And so I'm sure many of you are very familiar, but just to kind of give a little bit of framing on this particular dwarf mistletoe that I'll be talking about today. Eastern spruce dwarf mistletoe, also known as black spruce dwarf mistletoe, is a native pest in Minnesota's black spruce stands. It's a parasitic plant that commonly attacks black spruce, but it can also infect white spruce, balsam pine, if they're kind of near that infected spruce. And it grows into tree branches, steals water and nutrients, and eventually over time it can cause the tree to decline and lose needles or even die. And it spreads by kind of shooting these sticky seeds into the air, which rain down and land on nearby trees, but can also be carried by birds or wildlife. And so while this dwarf mistletoe is native to Minnesota, it's been here a long time, there really hasn't been much research done on how it's been managed and how effectively that management has been. And so that's kind of what our work aimed to do, investigate that question by conducting interviews and focus groups with loggers and foresters to better understand their perspectives, their experiences with dwarf mistletoe. They're the ones with boots on the ground, working with it. And so we wanted to know what impacts they were seeing, what treatments they were using to manage it, barriers to those treatments, and how effective they think those treatments have been. And so we focused in on northern Minnesota, but more specifically, Itasca, St. Louis, and Koochiching counties. We chose those because 95% of the black spruce volume that was harvested by county land departments in 2016 came from those counties. And so we felt like everyone working there would have a pretty good perspective on dwarf mistletoe and black spruce. I conducted 10 interviews and 3 focus groups with loggers who had black spruce sales in the study area within the last couple of years, and then 3 focus groups with foresters who work in that study area as well. And overall, we talked to over 60 folks. And these were all pre-COVID, so these were luckily in person. So through qualitative analysis of this interview and focus group data, which we had a lot of, as you might expect, talking to over 60 people, a lot of great overarching themes emerged, and too much that I can talk about today. So for today, just going to highlight a couple key things. But again, we have a lot of great data out of this study that I'm sure we'll share with you another time. For today, I'm going to just kind of talk about these themes in three key areas: educational related issues or themes, economic, and organizational. So one key theme related to educational needs or research needs was this idea of effectiveness. And first and foremost, loggers and foresters weren't even sure what being effective looks like or what that definition of effective is. What does it mean to be effective? One forester said, like a metric as far as to say this was successful or not, I don't think we have one. And I'm not really sure I can come up with one out of my mind anyway, as far as something I could go out and measure. Similarly, participants shared that there wasn't really research to show if what they're doing is effective. One forester said, I don't think there is any compelling evidence of it working. There's a lot of evidence for why it should work, but I don't think there's been any real publicized information that this is definitely working. I don't think it's been totally effectively studied in a convincing way. And if it has, it's not been communicated because a lot of folks are just still really unsure. A variety of themes related to the economics of managing dwarf mistletoe also emerged. And one of these was the cost burden for loggers to implement these dwarf mistletoe treatments in black spruce. And this was a theme we heard across focus groups, across the interviews. Whether that treatment was the 5-foot cutting rule or something similar, loggers were often instructed to cut or run down small, unmerchantable stems that takes time to do, and they don't make money off of doing that. And so, we can argue whether or not this should be taken into account in their bidding, but you can't really argue that it's certainly a cost that loggers are incurring. One logger concisely stated, if the trees are merchantable, it's not a problem, but clearing the land takes time, which equals money, and if all the wood is junk, shearing would be better. One logger suggested moving that cost burden back to the agencies. I think the agency should make their own task force, buy their own equipment. We'll just cut the harvestable. They can go back out, take care of the mistletoe if they want to. I don't know why it costs us every time they come up with a plan. And certainly while there's costs associated for loggers treating the dwarf mistletoe, there's also costs that foresters face if they want to do any additional treatments on the stand, like post-treatment shearing. And we often heard discussions of a lack of funding available to do those kinds of things, even if they wanted to. One forester described this: if it is unmerchantable, it's not always realistic to put it in the timber sale or have the logger do it. So then you have to follow up with a post-harvest treatment, which costs money, and there's not always necessarily money available, or it's not that high of a priority. Several themes also emerged around organizational level issues or needs. And one of those themes was this idea that sometimes there's conflicts over forest management goals, even within an organization. And one example we heard often was this practice of leave trees or reserves for wildlife habitat purposes, and how that could conflict with managing dwarf mistletoe if infected trees are still there. One forester stated simply, "I'm surprised anybody is intentionally leaving infected trees. It doesn't seem logical to me." A logger described feeling similarly, but maybe more boldly stated, that idea of leaving patches of black spruce, that is a wildlife nutty project. It's ignorant and needs to stop. Maybe there's a reason for it for tree types that don't get the disease, but if black spruce, for black spruce when dwarf mistletoe is already there, why in the world leave it? Another major theme at this organizational level was the idea that there was insufficient tracking of dwarf mistletoe and treatments. It's definitely related to not knowing if things are effective, if treatments are effective, but speaks more to the ideas around record keeping and long-term tracking of sites being managed. Participants discussed how frequent forester turnover in positions might mean there's less awareness of what's been done previously on sites, but more frequently, participants brought up the fact that since spruce rotation is so long, it's pretty rare that a single forester will see that same spruce stand go up for harvest more than once in their lifetime. And so that means the next forester to manage that site might not know what the previous site conditions were, what treatments were used, what the stand looked like 5 years afterwards, etc. One forester shared their perspective. Going into a stand now at age 30 or something, if you were to do a regen check, how do you know it had mistletoe 30 years ago before the sale? We just don't. I mean, all those records are in a file somewhere in somebody's office, but I'm not going to go through digging the attic files to look for that one sale from 35 years ago for a stand that's now fully stocked. Discussions also centered around regen checks versus actually looking for that dwarf mistletoe after harvest. Forster said that they aren't necessarily looking for that post-harvest, but just like instead what, regen is actually coming in. One forester said, "We have so little time. We're relying more on that quick check that we do as we drive by. You're not looking at the details of the mistletoe." And another major theme at that organizational level, but across organizations, was the lack of coordination among landowners or managers with regards to adjacent sites. And this was something that was discussed time and time again when participants were discussing effectiveness of treatments. They kept coming back to the idea that it's not going to be effective if an adjacent site to the harvest or treatment still has standing spruce with mistletoe, and it's just a cyclical infection. And if another land management agency or industry that borders that stand, there's just generally a lack of communication and
Join the
coordination
meeting.
between them. A logger described it in this way. I think a big issue is you have fragmented land. So this big spruce stand might be infected. One agency might cut theirs, they took care of their patch, clear cut, the loggers flatten it out. But if the adjoining landowner isn't on board with the fact that the mistletoe is there, it's just gonna blow back over and regen is all gonna have it. So if you really accomplished what you're after, I think that's a big thing is the agencies really need to be working together to get a good end result. So what does this mean for practitioners like yourself? I think first at the broadest level, there's definitely a need to define what success is when managing dwarf mistletoe. What does it look like to be effective? So some ways to answer these could be through more post-harvest visits to sites to just assess the effectiveness of post-treatments, not necessarily regen. Aerial surveys with drones or planes or satellites to assess dwarf mistletoe presence and spread. And obviously, as a researcher, more research studies to monitor sites post-treatment over time. There's also a need for improved system for tracking and monitoring and record keeping across the black spruce lifespan so that the data can be really clear and live on for whoever is going to be managing that stand next. Including things like site conditions and any level of infection before a harvest, what treatment was used post-treatments, and then all of those results from every time someone goes back to assess. Agencies also need improved coordination within their ranks and departments on establishing forest management goals and strategies. Take that example of retaining leaf trees. Foresters felt that any black spruce stems on a site is a forest health concern in terms of eliminating that pathogen to ensure healthy stands, future timber production. But wildlife managers saw removal of all stems sometimes as a forest health concern in terms of biodiversity and lack of habitat. And so while both groups are concerned about forest health, their goals for achieving that could be at odds. So whatever the solution is, organizations should aim for improved coordination, improved consistency within so that whatever treatment is used is as effective as it can be for their defined goals. There's also a big need for coordination among different landowners and managers with regards to adjacent stands. And we know flexibility and reactivity can differ among agencies, but land managers need to be proactive with stands that border land outside their jurisdiction. They should be regularly having conversations with other land managers, preparing for concurrent and coordinated management so that sites aren't regularly getting reinfected on this cyclical basis. And participants said that there's no reason they can't be doing this and having these conversations. It just takes being more proactive and takes effort to focus on a more landscape level view. This one's probably obvious, but there's clearly a need for more funding to help with dwarf mistletoe management. Loggers felt a heavy burden to cut and flatten every non-merchantable stem that they're not making money off of. So they don't have a big incentive to do that. So whether an option is paying loggers by the hour after they harvest everything merchantable to just flatten out a stand, or even contracting with them to shear that stand while it's still accessible, while they're still there. And similarly, more grant opportunities for foresters to do those post-treatments are needed. And then lastly, we really wanted to apply our lessons learned here to lodgepole pine dwarf mistletoe. Again, while our eastern spruce dwarf mistletoe, the one we've been talking about, is native here in Minnesota, there's a new invasive dwarf mistletoe coming, this lodgepole pine dwarf mistletoe, that's projected to have a larger impacts to our jack pines, such as rapid tree mortality and reduced timber yields. And so one purpose of this work was to also see what lessons we could learn here from our current dwarf mistletoe management that can translate over to help create a more proactive management plan for this new invasive species. So we hope to continue to work with practitioners like yourselves to, make sure we're prepared, ensure these lessons aren't in vain, and so on. So with that, I'll say thank you and acknowledge Charlie, Blinn with you, and Stephanie with the Forest Service, who are also part of this work. And I look